Everyone, this is Father Sean for our Year of the Eucharist videos, and this is the first video that happens in March. Of course, March is a month that's dedicated to St. Joseph throughout the Church. This year, Pope Francis has declared to be a year of St. Joseph. So for these videos in March, we're going to talk about St. Joseph and the Eucharist, maybe connections we can make, ways that St. Joseph kind of influences what we believe about the Eucharist. And so here we are in St. Lawrence Church, right in front of the statue of St. Joseph. And the place that St. Joseph shows up in the Gospels and the life of Jesus are all of those stories when Jesus is a child. To think about the angel coming to Joseph and then Joseph being present at the birth of Jesus there in Bethlehem. And maybe one of the remarkable things about Joseph and his relationship to Jesus is that Jesus, who is God incarnate, who is the one who is the Word that has helped created the world, entrusts himself to Joseph. Right? Things could have gone so poorly because Joseph is a human being with flaws like you and I. And you can imagine St. Joseph being given this incredible responsibility of protecting God's Son. Right, of being there and guarding. And Jesus is so vulnerable. He makes himself so incredibly vulnerable to something bad happening. You even think about the story of the flight into Egypt where Joseph has to save Jesus from being killed by oppressive murderers. And it's incredible to think about the vulnerability that Jesus takes upon himself in allowing St. Joseph to be responsible for him. And as we think about ourselves in the Eucharist, there's something very similar, that Jesus becomes so vulnerable. Not the vulnerability of a newborn child, but the vulnerability of a piece of bread. And he surrenders himself to us. He entrusts himself to us as the guardian, that we can misuse the Eucharist, we can receive the Eucharist, and then we can go scowl at the person sitting next to us. Or even for those of us that distribute the Eucharist, to think about this as the most precious treasure, God's only begotten Son, given to us who are weak, who are poor, like St. Joseph. Or even those who pray in the Eucharistic Adoration Chapel. Sometimes people who take hours in chapels are called guardians of the Eucharist, because one of your roles while you're there is, of course, to pray, to intercede, to meditate, but is also to make sure nothing bad happens. That you're a guardian of the Eucharist just as Joseph was the guardian of the Christ child. That you're there to make sure nobody does anything stupid. And praise God, I haven't heard of any incidents of somebody doing something terrible with the Eucharist, but that's because you're there. That's because you're there to make sure that Jesus is protected. It's why we make sure that Jesus is never left unaccompanied. It's why when nobody shows up in the next hour, that's why we ask the person to wait until somebody else shows up, so that we don't leave Jesus even more vulnerable or more exposed. And so it's incredible that he gives us this responsibility, that Jesus hands himself over to us in something so vulnerable as a child to St. Joseph, but as vulnerable as a piece of bread. And so it invites us to this responsibility, that we cherish this gift, but we take responsibility that Jesus gives himself to us in the Eucharist. And so we look to St. Joseph to have the right attitude, to have that attitude of protector of Christ in the Eucharist, but also one that appreciates it. Of course, Jesus is appreciated by Joseph in his infancy, in his vulnerability. So maybe today we thank God for this incredible responsibility, the gift of Christ's vulnerability to us in the Eucharist, and then the fact that he invites us to this incredible task. God is so good. He gives us the Eucharist, and he gives us the example of St. Joseph to show us how we should behave around the Eucharist. Take care, and we look forward to seeing you next week as we reflect on St. Joseph and what he means for the Eucharist.